Welcome back to Key Messianic Prophecies, a podcast brought to you by Teleios, private 501c3 nonprofit foundation dedicated to the research and accurate teaching of the Bible, founded by Bill and Jeanette Stewart. On this episode, we will continue our look at Messianic prophecy in the Psalms by focusing on Psalms 1 and 2. While different methods of study, such as form criticism, suggest that the Psalms should be read in isolation, remember that in our previous episode, we looked at the importance of a canonical reading of the Psalms, recognizing and reading the book of Psalms as a collective whole, and the significance that has for Messianic prophecy. We'll be approaching the first two Psalms using this method. Now, taken together, Psalms 1 and 2 form a kind of introduction to the Psalter itself. We find here the introduction of language and motifs that will recur throughout the entire book. We find in these two psalms the portrayal of a divine king and conqueror, the traditional messianic figure of the Hebrew Scriptures, whom the kings of earth oppose and who Psalm 2 clearly establishes as being of the royal house of David by referencing the Davidic covenant. In this introduction to the Psalter, we also see that this messianic figure will sit on the throne of heaven, that he will inherit the entire world, and that he has been given authority to conquer his enemies. But Psalm 2 is not the only psalm to reference the Messiah here, and we cannot divorce Psalm 2 from the preceding psalm. In Psalm 1, we find an image of a man who is like a tree, and that tree accompanies a garden metaphor. This garden imagery we should already be familiar with, as the Bible's narrative began in a garden, which is the image of paradise. Remember that the whole apparatus of Messianic prophecy is to restore that paradise, which was surrendered in the garden called Eden. In other words, God's promises throughout the Hebrew Scriptures thus far have all moved the narrative in the direction of an ultimate fulfillment of those promises via a coming Messianic figure. And here in Psalms 1 and 2, we find that future paradise imagined as an eschatological triumph of God's kingdom through his chosen king, the man who is pictured in Psalm 1 and who conquers in Psalm 2. How interesting that Paul himself, in Ephesians, envisions Christ's followers as having been seated with Christ in the heavens, enjoying all his blessings. If we look at Psalm 1 and 2 as messianic in nature, then we see that the Psalter calls upon all to trust in God's messianic figure in order to receive the blessing that comes through knowing him. Thus, by implication, those who are faithful to Messiah will enjoy his blessings and also receive his inheritance, which we find in the New Testament is the crux of the gospel taught by Paul. And this is only the beginning of our look at the Psalms. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Key Messianic Prophecies. Next episode, we will continue looking at Messianic prophecy in the Psalms, focusing specifically on Psalm 8.